This video will review the Excel skills you need to complete Case 8. The topic, pivot tables. Pivot tables are a very useful tool in Excel to summarize and get information from large data sets. Your database table, let me remind you, has to be isolated from the rest of your worksheet. And that means that the row above your headings and the column to the side of your table should always be blank. To begin, click on any cell inside the table, and from the Insert ribbon, click Pivot Table, or click on Pivot Chart and select Pivot Chart and Pivot Table, and you will simultaneously get a column chart to go with your report. But it is very easy to add a chart to an existing pivot table report after you have created it. I will create a pivot table. Notice that my table range is correct because it's isolated from the rest of my worksheet. Excel wants to put the results on a new worksheet, which is what you should do for your case. But for my examples, I'm going to put the results on the existing worksheet in a location off to the side, for example, into cell G4. When you've set up everything properly, you should have a list of all the column headings at the top of your window pane. Now we need a question. So the first question will be, sum the salaries for each department and find out which department has the highest sum of salaries. So you have to, at a minimum, click into two of these boxes to create a pivot table report. And the first box should be your grouping level. So if I want to see salaries by department or for each department, then department is my grouping level and it belongs in the rows quadrant down below. Sometimes Excel guesses correctly and sometimes it doesn't, so you have to understand. So department is my grouping level, and then I click salary. Because salaries are values or numbers, Excel automatically puts that field into the values quadrant and applies the sum function. So I have my results. What I can do with my results, I can easily format the numbers, and while I'm here I can sort the numbers, for example from highest to lowest, which then answers the question, which department has the highest sum of salaries, and the answer is Department D. I can also show my results as a percentage rather than as absolute numbers. To do that, click on the arrow next to Sum of Salary, Value Field Settings, and click on the tab Show Values As, and from the list you make a selection. I will choose percent of grand total, and so now I can easily see that Department D represents the highest percentage of all the salaries. I can also easily change the sum function to a different function, again by going to Value Field Settings and changing the function to average, for example. And I have to go back to Show Values As and remove the percentage. And now I have a list of average salaries for each department, still in order from highest to lowest. Okay, let's ask a different question. I would like to count the number of IDs in each location. Each location means that location is my grouping level and it belongs in the rows quadrant. Now I want to count the IDs, so I will click next to ID, but here's an example of when Excel is guessing wrong. This doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to drag and drop the ID field into the values quadrant, where Excel automatically changes the function from sum to count. And why is that? It's because ID was entered as text. It's a text field, and all you can do with text fields is count them. So now we have a count, but I need to change the format to remove the currency symbols. There are 500 people in total, and that is a distribution by location. Now, what if we did not want to see all the locations? Because let's say we had a list of 50 locations and we didn't want to see all of them. Then we can filter the locations, and the easiest way to do that is to click on that down arrow next to row labels, and this works just like an auto filter would in a normal database table. And I can remove, click on select all, and then simply click on the location I'm interested in, or more than one location I'm interested in, and that's all that I'm going to see. At the same time, you can see in the top of the window pane there's a filter icon next to the location field, which indicates there is a filter on that field, and now I'm going to clear that filter to remove it. Now what I'm going to do is add another field to my pivot table report, because clearly we can have more than 2 fields on a pivot table report. So I'm going to add department, and now we have a 2-level sort. First by location, and then within location by department. Or you can switch these two around by dragging and dropping in the rows quadrant, and now it displays first by department and within department by location. I can also take one of these fields and drag and drop into the columns quadrant, and that just gives me a different perspective that creates a table that perhaps is a little easier to read. Now, what if I wanted to count to the number of IDs by department, but not for every location? So that requires a filter. So this time I'm going to take the location field from the rows quadrant and drag it into the filters quadrant. It changes the view of my pivot table report, and now at the top here in cell H2 I can select only the locations I'm interested in. So here's a count of ID by department, but only in the Mississauga location. Or I could change that to North York. Or if I had wanted to say Mississauga and North York, I have to click on select multiple items, and then I can select more than one. Now I will show you how easy it is to add a chart after the fact. So select any cell inside of your report, and then from the Analyze ribbon, click Pivot Chart, and then make a selection with respect to chart type. And it just floats underneath, and it immediately makes your data visual, and again it makes it easier to answer the questions. The last example I will give you is to work with date fields. So let's remove what we've done so far and click and delete the chart. This time, let us count the number of IDs that were hired in each year. So hire date becomes my grouping level. And look what happens with dates. Excel 2016 and higher or newer versions immediately summarize dates by years, and then within years by quarters. Let's leave it the way it is right now. We'll click on ID, and of course the ID belongs in the values quadrant. And now we can easily see how many people were hired in each year. If I remove the check mark next to years, it defaults to summarizing by quarters. And if I remove the check mark next to quarters, it defaults by showing me how many people were hired in each month. And finally, two more things you ought to know about pivot tables. The first one is, if any of the data in your database table changes, then you have to refresh the pivot table. It doesn't automatically change if your input data changes. And you do that by clicking inside your report, selecting the Analyze ribbon, and clicking on the refresh icon. So you have to remember to do that. And lastly, how do you delete a pivot table report? Select the entire report, and then from the Home ribbon, clear all, and that removes the pivot table report from your worksheet. And that concludes the review of the Excel skills required to complete this case.